This column that I've written to coincide with Gandhi Jayanti this year focuses on an ongoing discussion among analysts about Indian state power, about the relative importance of soft power and hard power. I've always believed that India's influence, global influence, has been far in excess of its what we understand as hard power. The two main components of hard power are military power and economic power. Countries like the United States have had both for a long, long time. China, for a long time, um, over a long time, acquired economic power. It has not yet adequately acquired military power. A combination of the two is what we regard as hard power. While soft power is the influence that nations have, and that influence can take many forms. It's cultural influence, religious influence, intellectual influence, the importance of science. Some countries in Europe have an enormous influence on world affairs or thinking around the world because of their contribution to knowledge, to science, and to modern technology, etc. One of the earliest examples of Indian soft power was in fact the way in which Mahatma Gandhi mobilized the people of India against the British Empire. The British Empire had enormous hard power. It was able to mobilize thousands of police and army and armed forces and ammunition and equipment, and it had power around the world in the early part of the 20th century. Yet Mahatma Gandhi, through a very simple idea of non-cooperation, followed by things like salt satyagraha, which were essentially non-violent interventions, political interventions, mobilized the people of India against the British Empire. And that's a classic example of soft power defeating hard power. Not only was Gandhiji's influence restricted to India, the way in which India acquired independence over the British rule inspired anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. So Mahatma Gandhi became a symbol of liberation for people around the world. And finally, after the Second World War, the British Empire slowly dissolved, both due to the hard power consequences of the Second World War, where the United States had to come to Britain's rescue and US emerged as the dominant world power, and Britain declined as a world power. And also, of course, Russia emerged, as Soviet Union emerged as a dominant world power. But apart from that hard power consequences of the Second World War, we have the soft power impact of the decline of colonialism or the anti-colonial movement, the nationalist movements in the colonies, all of which weakened the influence and control of the British Empire around the world. So it's a classic example of soft power. Now you come after independence, the manner in which Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru used this influence of India around the Third World to make India the original voice of the global South. I mean, the non-aligned movement was started by India, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, Egypt. These were the countries that were leaders of the non-aligned movement, which refused to go into any hard power alliance, either with the United States or with the Soviet Union, which were both hard power alliances, the NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and yet had enormous international influence. It's a different matter that India did not become a member of the UN Security Council, and there's a history to that. And yet, in the UN General Assembly, countries like India had enormous influence. So the first point I make in remembering the intellectual, political, historical contribution of Mahatma Gandhi is that Indian influence has been far in excess of Indian power. One can actually go back in history and see the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism across Asia. You travel east from China to Korea to Japan to Indonesia to Thailand to Vietnam, Cambodia, I mean, right across Asia. Both Hinduism and Buddhism had enormous influence and continue to have enormous influence. And again, that is an example of Indian soft power, that India has a global presence far in excess of its military presence or its economic presence. In fact, as an economic power, India is still a marginal player. Our share of world trade is not yet anywhere near that, for example, of China. And our military is still dependent on imported equipment. One of the few major powers that still has to import equipment, whether from Russia or United States or Israel or Sweden or whichever other country. So India's hard power is still quite limited, but India's soft power is enormous. And we saw that in the recent global G20 summit, where India was able to get across a resolution because of its influence, because many countries were willing, did not want the New Delhi summit to fail, including the United States. We were able to bring the African Union into the G20. Prime Minister Narendra Modi organized the Voice of the Global South Summit in January this year. Again, exploiting India's soft power. And, because after all, in Africa, China has a larger presence, both as a economic and a military power. But India's presence has been there historically and culturally. And therefore, there is a certain role that India has played in Africa's own liberation. So therefore, I think we need to understand the relative importance of soft and hard power. Now, the contemporary context in which I write this column is the debate that has been going on in India about the muscular nature of the Narendra Modi government. That we respond muscularly, unlike in the past when Pakistan terrorists come across India, we went across the border and hit them. Now, vis-a-vis Pakistan, we can respond muscularly, and we have responded muscularly. We have not been able to do that adequately vis-a-vis, for example, China, which still occupies some parts of our territory. So therefore, this muscular approach has limits. And the whole debate between India's hard power and soft power has suddenly erupted in the West with the accusations of Prime Minister Trudeau that Indian agents were responsible for the assassination of a pro-Khalistan Sikh in Canada. Now, if this accusation had been made 10 years back, when India was not claiming this muscular power of its ability to go out and hit at enemies, nobody would have believed India. I mean, when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, if somebody had said India ordered assassination of someone, nobody would have believed India. And even today, there is no evidence that actually India has done this. And yet many people seem to believe, particularly in the West, because of India's new image as asserting its hard power and its muscular approach. So the United States, for example, which is a good friend of India, has in fact asked us to cooperate with Canada in bringing this whole issue to an end. Now, why is it that even though many of us in India do not believe this accusation, there are many around the world who think there may be some truth in this? I think that is because of the way in which we are asserting our hard power without actually having that hard power. I think there are limits to what we can do outside the country. And therefore, it's important, one, to understand, how much power do you have, how do you articulate that power, and also what is India's image. I mean, India's real image internationally is of a developing country that has been committed for 75, 76 years to the principles of liberal democracy, pluralism, multiculturalism. This has been India's example. When the nuclear deal was being done between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President George Bush, and President George Bush came under a lot of attack in the United States, saying, "Why are you doing this? Why are you giving this, benefit to India?" He said, "Because India is a democracy. It's a plural democracy, and we need to strengthen this democracy against an autocracy like China. China is an authoritarian system, and we need to help India build India because India is a democracy." This has been an extremely important aspect of our global personality. And therefore, it is an aspect of our personality that we must defend to the core. Unfortunately, in the last few years, because of the kind of attacks on the media, because of the way in which dissident elements have been harassed, imprisoned, because of the fact that many in the media have been kind of arm twisted into supporting the government, etc., there is an impression that has gained ground that India is less of a democracy. I think that is the context in which people around the world are beginning to believe. Someone like Trudeau, who's a bit of a joker from all accounts, and not taken particularly seriously as a political leader, but people are beginning to believe him. And I think that is something we need to guard against. We need to defend our reputation as a democracy, as a liberal democracy, as a country with the rule of law, that people who do not obey the rule of law are subject to the institutions of democracy, institutions of the rule of law. And India has certain values. And these values are extremely important. It's simply not, we are not a cowboy nation that will go out and shoot somebody just because that guy doesn't like us or disagrees with us or threatens us. And I think that is what we need to remember on the occasion of Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary, because Gandhiji gave India a certain status in world affairs, which even today the entire world recognizes. Don't forget that at the G20 summit, Prime Minister Modi led the entire leadership of the G20 to Rajghat, and they all paid homage to the memory of Mahatma Gandhi.